Hello, my name is Scott Rodilitz. I'm going to be presenting on some joint work with Vahideh and Manshadi called Online Policies for Efficient Volunteer Crowdsourcing. Now, our work can apply in a broad variety of volunteer management contexts, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to focus on our motivating application domain of food recovery. Now, why is food recovery important? Well, in the US, we waste over 60 million tons of food annually, and this occurs all throughout the production and consumption process. And yet, simultaneously, there are 54 million Americans who live in food insecure households, a number that has gone up substantially as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what we have is a significant opportunity to collect food that would otherwise be wasted and deliver it to people who need it. So why don't we do this right now? Well, there's a few key challenges, a few roadblocks that get in the way. The first is that making connections between potential food donors and potential food recipients is challenging. And second, even after these connections have been made, the transportation between those two entities, particularly the last mile transportation, can be costly. Now, luckily, we live in a day and age in which online platforms have stepped up to address all sorts of societal problems, and this is no exception. Many platforms have emerged in recent years, and they have different designs, but in general, they all serve to facilitate connections between food donors and food recipients, and to support the transportation component. Many of these organizations use volunteers, including Food Rescue US, which is an organization that we've been collaborating with for the past few years, and the focus of our application area. So Food Rescue US has had a pretty significant top-line impact. They've delivered nearly 50 million meals to food insecure Americans all across the country. They're active in over 30 locations, so they're nationwide, and yet they operate on a hyper-local level. Now, in each of these locations where they're most active, they have a site director, and the site director is in charge of some very important off-platform and on-platform work. So they're in charge of recruitment of volunteers and donors. And once they have a donation in place, they create a schedule for pickup and drop-off that they post to the Food Rescue US app and website. They then rely on volunteers to log in and sign up to pick up food. So here's one example from the New Haven area. There's a pickup from Yale West Campus Dining Hall to be delivered to Morrissey Manor Public Housing. And it's scheduled to be picked up between 2:30 and 3 p.m. Now, if the time of day approaches for this donation and no one has signed up, the site directors need to rely on notifications, on nudging mechanisms, to try to encourage volunteers to sign up because they don't want these donations to go to waste. So the goal of our work is to design efficient nudging mechanisms, efficient policies for sending notifications that can encourage volunteers to pick up donations and reduce the number of missed pickups. That's going to be the focus of this work. So when we think about notifying volunteers, there's a few considerations we need to keep in mind. The first is that these notifications need to be infrequent. You've probably all downloaded an app and immediately been inundated with notifications, and that's extremely discouraging. You've probably either silenced notifications or even deleted the app entirely, and that's something that site directors are keen to avoid for Food Rescue US. Now, in addition, because we're dealing with volunteer labor and not paid labor, we can't require a response, and we certainly can't require a prompt response. And so site directors want to make a one-time decision about which volunteers to notify about a donation. Now, these considerations are consistent with the literature on volunteer management, and yet taken together, they paint a pretty challenging picture within which we need to operate. And to motivate that, let's take a look at a toy example. So suppose we have 2 volunteers, V and U, and suppose we can notify each volunteer every 2 days. Now, if there's a donation that's available today, we may want to maximize the probability that that donation gets picked up by notifying both V and U. Now, as long as one of them responds, that donation is going to get picked up, that's great. But what that means is that tomorrow, if a donation arrives, we can't notify either V or U, and so that donation is not going to get picked up. So what we have is this classic OR trade-off between maximizing the probability that a donation today gets picked up versus maximizing the probability that something in the future gets picked up. Present and future payoffs, and we're trying to balance those. So the current Food Rescue US strategy is to send notifications at most once per week, and when they choose which volunteers to notify, they do so in a random ad hoc way. Site directors tend to pick a small subset of volunteers that they haven't yet notified this week and hope that one of them responds. Now, in addition to not being very data-driven, this is a pretty time-consuming process for site directors. They have to monitor which donations are available, and they have to figure out which volunteers they haven't yet notified this week. And so what we want to do is automate this process by leveraging the untapped potential of data to help make good decisions. To motivate that this is possible, well, let's take a quick look at some data from Food Rescue US. And in particular, I want to highlight two things. First, on the left, you'll see a principal component analysis of rescues. So each component captures things like time of day, location, day of week, that sort of thing. Each color in that plot is a volunteer, and the size of each circle is proportional to the number of rescues with those characteristics that that volunteer has completed. All I want to do is draw your attention to the fact that there is a lot of clustering going on by color, which suggests that volunteers have predictable and stable preferences. Now, on the right, we use that historical data to make predictions about whether volunteers will respond to notifications, and we see that we can make quite accurate predictions using that data. So given that we have this data, how can we ultimately use that as a component of making notification decisions? And that's our goal with this work. So the first thing we're going to do is introduce the online volunteer notification problem. It's a pretty general framework for leveraging data to make better notification decisions. But unfortunately, it's intractable to solve optimally. So instead, we're going to develop online policies with constant factor guarantees. And we're going to evaluate those policies by comparing them against hardness results and by testing them on data from Food Rescue US. All right, so that's our roadmap. Let's dive into the model. So the online volunteer notification problem is a generalization of online stochastic bipartite matching, where we have a set of offline vertices, which represent volunteers, and a set of online vertices, which arrive according to a known time-varying rate, which are our donations. So we're going to use our toy example from earlier to illustrate our model. So we've got these two volunteers, V and U, and here's where we depart a bit from the literature. V and U will always remain in the system, even after being matched. They'll just be in one of two states. They'll either be active or inactive. Now, initially, all volunteers are active, and if a donation arrives and an active volunteer is notified, they'll respond with their pair-specific match probability, which, as we discussed moments ago, can be accurately estimated from data. Now, we can notify a subset of volunteers in the hopes that at least one responds, and as long as one of them does, this donation gets completed. However, after being notified, volunteers transition into the inactive state, and they will remain there for a random amount of time tau, which is drawn from an interactivity time distribution G. We're going to leave this distribution general, and our results are going to depend on a feature of that distribution. In this toy example, where we can notify volunteers every 2 days, that's a deterministic interactivity time distribution where G of 2 equals 1. And what it means is that if we notify both volunteers today and a donation arrives tomorrow, neither volunteer is active, and so neither will respond to notifications. This means that that donation will not get picked up, which is of course unfortunate because our goal is to maximize the total expected number of completed donations. I want to emphasize that this is a non-linear function. It's submodular in the subset of volunteers which are notified. And so the underlying dynamic program that we would need to solve to optimally solve the online volunteer notification problem is high dimensional. And so we're not going to be able to solve it optimally. It's going to depend jointly on the state of all volunteers, as well as potentially, which is potentially unknown, because this interactivity time distribution may be stochastic. So just to summarize, we have a set of volunteers which are always in the system, either active or inactive. We have donations that arrive according to a known time-varying rate. When a donation does become available, we need to decide immediately and irrevocably about which subset of volunteers to notify. And after notifying volunteers, they will respond with their pair-specific match probability if active. Otherwise, they'll ignore the notification. And an active volunteer will then become inactive according to this interactivity time distribution. Because we're not able to solve this problem optimally, our goal is to design online notification policies that perform well compared to a benchmark. Now, the benchmark we're going to use is a clairvoyant solution that knows the arrival sequence of donations in advance and knows the state of volunteers in each time period. Because that clairvoyant solution is difficult to characterize, we're actually going to upper bound it with a linear program, which is somewhat standard in the online bipartite matching literature. All right, I mentioned some of these literature areas. I want to emphasize that we contribute to a few different streams. On the application side, our work is related to volunteer operations and crowdsourcing, as well as to matching and allocation for nonprofits. And on the more technical side, our work builds on results in online reusable resource allocation and profit inequalities. There's some active and growing literature areas that we're excited to be a part of. All right, so as I mentioned, our main results are going to be relative to our LP benchmark, and they're also going to depend on a feature of this interactivity time distribution. Now, that feature is what we call the minimum discrete hazard rate. We parameterize it with Q, and essentially it's saying that a volunteer who is inactive is going to become active the next period with probability at least Q, no matter how long they've been inactive for. So as Q gets bigger, volunteers are certainly more likely to become active in the subsequent period. Now, as you might expect, both our lower bound and our upper bound are increasing in Q. Now, our upper bound comes from two examples, one of which is particularly challenging when Q is small but positive. I'm not going to get into the details here. Suffice it to say that it holds for any online policy, even those that cannot be computed in polynomial time. Our lower bound comes from two policies that we design. They're non-adaptive, they're fairly simple, and they're certainly computable in polynomial time. And I'm going to talk to you about one of those policies in a bit more detail, called our sparse notification policy. So the key idea of our sparse notification policy is to start with an ex-ante solution X star and sparsify it by solving a sequence of low-dimensional dynamic programs. Now recall, one of the key challenges of the online volunteer notification problem was that the underlying dynamic program was high-dimensional, and thus we weren't able to solve it in polynomial time. Now, to sidestep that issue, we decouple the problem by creating an artificial ranking among volunteers, such that if multiple volunteers respond to a notification, it's the highest ranked volunteer that gets credit for completing the donation. Now, this allows us to decouple their contributions such that to sparsify our ex-ante solution, we only need to solve one low-dimensional dynamic program per volunteer. And we're going to do that in order of this artificial rank. So to be very precise, we're going to start with our top-ranked volunteer, and we'll start at the end of our time horizon. And for each possible arriving donation D, we're going to decide whether it would be better to send a notification or whether it would be better to save this volunteer for the future. Now, if we send a notification, we get two rewards. One is immediate. That's if this volunteer responds to our notification, and if they're the highest ranked volunteer to do so. Now, this relies on the solution of higher ranked volunteers dynamic programs, which is why we need to solve them in sequence. Now, after being notified, this volunteer is going to become inactive, only to become active again according to their interactivity time distribution. Now, alternatively, if we don't notify this volunteer, they remain active in the subsequent period, or regardless of when they become active again, at that point, they contribute a value to go. Now, working from back to front, we're able to compute this sparsification as well as this value to go. We do this for the top ranked volunteer, and then we proceed sequentially doing so for all volunteers. Now again, if we do send a notification, if it's better to do so, then we will send that notification, but only with probability given by the ex-ante solution. So we're taking this ex-ante solution and sparsifying it. We're doing this all up front. So in the online phase, whenever a donation arrives, we flip a weighted coin about notifying each volunteer, and we do so independently and non-adaptively. So in the paper, we're able to formulate a linear program which lower bounds the expected number of completed donations, and we construct a feasible solution to its dual to reveal that our sparse notification policy guarantees at least 1 minus 1 over E times 1 over 2 minus Q of our benchmark. Now that first factor comes from the submodularity of our objective, and the second comes from this sparsification procedure I just described. Now, it's great to have a theoretical guarantee. We're also interested in how our policy performs in practice, and I'm excited to report that simulated results suggest that it performs quite well. So here we've tried to be as faithful as we could to the Food Rescue US setting. We've constructed instances for each location relying on historical data. And here we're comparing our sparse notification policy to heuristics that represent current practice, which, as we discussed, is to notify a small, randomly chosen subset of active volunteers. Now we're going to follow the Food Rescue US strategy of notifying volunteers at most once per week. And as you can see, we consistently outperform these heuristics. Now, some of this outperformance is due to our use of data, and some is due to how our policy cleverly uses that data. Our policy also performs well compared to stronger data-driven heuristics like a rolling horizon approach. So not only are these results promising, we're also excited about the opportunity to automate this process, which would free up site directors to focus on more productive activities, like recruiting more volunteers, recruiting more donors, and growing the system. So we focused entirely so far on this application in food recovery. I want to take a step back at the very end of this talk and say that we think our work can be used broadly to improve the efficiency and engagement of notification systems, which are commonly used in volunteer contexts. About 30% of US volunteers churn each year, which represents a loss of $70 billion annually, as well as it's a huge strain on these volunteer organizations that routinely have to train and retrain volunteers. Now, many of these organizations use just mass notification systems, and we think better volunteer management can increase this retention and do so in a more clever, data-driven way. Of course, we think our work can be applied beyond volunteerism, both to drive social network engagement and improve crowdfunding campaigns and avoid the negative consequences of marketing fatigue. Like I said, we're excited about this work. I hope you check out the paper, and of course, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks so much.